Welcome, welcome. You are listening to, you are witnessing, you are watching Humanity in the Headlines. I am your host, Atiba Buchanan. I am joined and flanked by my main man, my co-host, my pal, Mr. David Seaton. How you doing, sir?
What's going on, man?
Good to see you. Good to see you on this mildly nice Saturday.
Is it April?
I know,
Wasn't
right?
the first day of spring? What is
February?
What is going on? For all the people out there in Chicagoland, what I don't get it.
Yeah. Only in Chicago can you get 4 seasons in 2 weeks.
Exactly.
And two seasons in the same day.
Because it's going to be this is going to be one of those years where we just go straight from winter to summer.
Right. There will be no spring. So, thank you for joining us today on IntellectualRadio.com, on YouTube, on Facebook Live. We thank you so much. Everybody on Facebook Live, please feel free to share the video. Please feel free to comment, engage us. We'd love to read your comments live on air. We have a lot to talk about today, Dave. Again, it just stuns me every week that not just the things that we have to talk about, but the things that we won't get a chance to talk about. I did want to go ahead and let you open with the thing that kind of had you passionate this week as it pertained to the I think the lady that did not get shot.
We had the saw a story this week where this and I forget what city it was in or what state it was in, but you're talking about the
one that had you all fired up.
Oh yeah. I know what you're talking about, but just if you go to my Facebook page, you'll see a story earlier this week where a white woman got pulled. As a matter of fact, I remember it was in Dallas. So it was in Texas. White woman gets pulled over by a traffic cop. Some altercation ensued, and she shot the arresting officer, or the officer that pulled her over,
in the shoulder.
Shot him in the shoulder. Gets in her car, drives away, and a chase ensues where they shot at her. The police, whether they were trying to catch her, they shot at her and missed, and they took her into custody alive after she shot a police officer at a traffic stop.
Yeah.
So basically the lesson is, my people, if you want to shoot a police officer and survive the altercation, you need to put some very light makeup on because if you have any melanin in your skin, you know how they, I mean, again, that's just asinine, because if you think about how many unarmed black men
and women
who get shot, who get murdered by the police routinely. This woman shot an officer and got taken into custody. And when I remember when I posted the story, and I couldn't wrap my mind around it. Like, how did this woman shoot a police officer and get taken into custody? And one of the first responses on my feed was, "Well, what did you want her to? What did you want to have happen? Her get shot? Yeah." Crazy idea that everyone should get treated the same by the police. And again, when just to again, now you got me fired up because I remember the story. But when you heard the White House come out a couple of weeks ago when we had that incident that happened in Sacramento, and Sarah Huckabee Sanders said from the podium, "Well, hey, that's a local problem.
Yep.
We're not gonna comment on a local problem." But when you see African Americans get treated the same all over the country, regardless of the geographic, regardless of the state, regardless of the city, regardless of their socioeconomics, when the one common denominator is African American, and you just know how the story is going to end. But like I said, this white woman shot a cop from a traffic stop, and she got taken into custody without incident. That just goes, and if you pay attention to these stories, usually this is how it happens. You'll see a story. There'll be a story of somebody that gets killed by the cops who is an African American, and then somewhere buried somewhere you'll see a story like this. But they'll never talk about that on the national news.
Correct.
They'll never talk about, because if they talk about a white woman shooting a cop and getting taken into custody without incident, then that's going to force us to have this conversation.
Beg the question, right?
That's too much in your face. But again, if you can Google it. All you have to do is Google white woman shoots police officer, and you'll see the story pop up that happened in Dallas, Texas. But again, my point is, it's a national problem. It's an epidemic, and if we had the will to really address this historical systemic racism that permeates our law enforcement, if we had the will to do it, we could solve it, but we don't.
And that's something we engage almost weekly on this show, right? And again, the painful thing is that every week there are scores of stories we don't even get a chance to highlight, that we don't get a chance to discuss, because again, it's much bigger than the one or two stories that make the national headlines in a given month. With that said, again, thank you so much, Dave, for getting that off your chest, making our viewers aware, our viewers and listeners aware.
My blood pressure was cool until you brought that up. I have to calm down now.
So what do we have today? Today we're going to talk about the teacher strikes / walkouts in the red states. I know the three off the top of my head are Oklahoma, West Virginia, and Arizona. There is a fourth, Arkansas.
Kentucky.
It's Kentucky.
Kentucky is having an issue. I have a very good friend who lives in Kentucky, who lives in Louisville and is a public school teacher. So she's kind of giving me some information about what's going on with them from the ground.
So we're going to talk about those walkouts and how they correlate directly to Republican policies, specifically tax cuts, which fund our educational programs. And we're definitely going to break that down for you today, give you some things to think about. And later in the show, we're going to talk about the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. More specifically, we're going to talk about the inaccuracies of his legacy and how it's been sanitized and whitewashed, and how we need and how that hurts us today. Joining us for that conversation will be none other than the son of a civil rights leader, Jesse Jackson, his son, Jonathan Jackson, who is actually named after Martin Luther King Jr. His name is Jonathan Luther Jackson. And I'm sure most of our listeners didn't know this, but he's actually, Martin Luther King Jr. was actually the godfather to Jonathan Jackson. So I'm sure he's going to have an insight for us unlike no other. And that's going to be an amazing conversation. So you want to stick with us throughout the hour. Anything else that I'm missing, Dave?
There's so many things.
Right.
There's so many.
We won't get to the Trump administration today.
We talk about Scott Pruitt.
Right. We got Scott Pruitt, and we still got Stormy Daniels, and that keeps evolving. We still have Robert Mueller, and his investigation and evolving.
The EPA.
Yeah.
You got to, that whole, it has been amazing to me to watch Republicans just themselves trying to justify how Scott Pruitt was paying $50 per night in Washington D.C. hotel room. Oh, it's common rent. I saw Jack Kingston this morning on CNN.
Right.
He was like, oh, $1,500 a month. That's market. I've been to Washington, D.C. If there's anybody out there who's watching or who's listening, go ahead and post something and let me know when's it's hard to find a hotel room in Chicago for $50 a night on Priceline.
Exactly.
But he said he got $50 a night
in D.C.
in Washington,
around the
D.C.,
corner from the White House,
a block away from 1600 Pennsylvania
And moreover,
Avenue.
for those that don't know, Scott Pruitt, head of the EPA, was renting an apartment that was owned by a lobbyist.
The wife of the lobbyist.
The wife of the lobbyist, of someone that routinely goes to the White House, whose job it is to lobby for.
Exxon is one of their major clients.
Yeah, Exxon is one of their major clients.
But they didn't have any business before the EPA, so there was no conflict of interest.
Exactly. So that's what makes this whole thing stink to high hell. But we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to definitely dive right into this conversation about these red states teacher walkouts. Thank you for listening to Humanity in the Headlines on IntellectualRadio.com. We'll be right back. We are back on Humanity in the Headlines. Dave, this is something that I'm always down to talk about education in whatever form. I'm certainly always down to talk about equality in whatever form. So whenever I get an opportunity for these two things to meet, I'm always excited. I'm one of those people. I like unions. I like to see unions fight for people because I know that we haven't always where this country, how this country has evolved, how we went from not having weekends at all. Again, people forget weekends have not always been a thing. You used to work 6 to 7 days a week routinely. That's what was expected. Child labor laws have not always been a thing.
8-hour work days and 40-hour work weeks and overtime.
Right.
People take that stuff for granted.
Right. That has not always been a thing. So, first and foremost, I applaud all of these teachers for the stances that they have taken for themselves, for their students, for their communities. Because at the end of the day, a country is only as strong as its educational system. In my opinion, this is just me. You can have all the big guns, you can have all that big stuff, but if you are not raising a smart, learned community of people, then it's only those guns can only protect you for so long. And
can I jump in real quick?
Oh, by all means.
No coincidence, and you said it right at the open that all of these issues are happening in red states.
Oh yeah, we're getting to that.
But I think it's important while we laud and applaud these teachers for taking a stand, we also have to remember that these teachers who are also citizens and voters in their respective states have voted for policies and politicians that are actually the cause of the situation that they find themselves in. That's the conundrum here,
right? And the irony,
right? They voted in. They have voted in politicians that have said we're spending too much money.
Yep. We're not even spending too much. Well, they've said we're spending too much money and we're taxing too much. And what pays for your public educational system is tax dollars. So again, I thought it was brilliant when you made the initial correlation between the tax cuts in these cities, and then I was able to pick up on a couple of pundits that were able to really outline the problem in these states. So again, I picked up a piece. The teacher strikes have exposed the GOP's Achilles heel. This is a New York magazine written on April 5th by Eric Levitz, and it was an amazing piece. He makes a couple of highlights here. I'm going to read directly from the piece for a moment. Last week, Republicans in Oklahoma actually voted to raise taxes on fossil fuel companies, so as to increase pay for public sector workers. I'm gonna stop right there. They approved to vote to raise taxes to raise taxes on fossil fuel companies in Oklahoma to pay for public sector workers. They were able to get these teachers a $6,000 a year raise. And you know what the teacher said? Not enough. Nice, but not enough.
The irony of it when you're talking about a state like Oklahoma.
Right.
Oklahoma, while they were cutting spending and they were cutting taxes, they were also giving these huge tax subsidies to fossil fuel corporations that drill for oil in their same state. So again, like you said, the public school, everything public is funded by taxes. So again, we're getting to the point where we're getting to this feedback loop where they keep saying, oh, there's all these millions of jobs out there, but there's not anybody trained to take them.
Right.
So you've got these jobs out there that could be taken, but nobody's trained to take them. But you're defunding public schools and you're defunding trade schools and everything else, trying to privatize everything. So it gets back on itself.
So let me read a little bit more from the piece, and this is where it really gets profound. It says, all of this has made increasing taxes on the state's top industry so unthinkable to Oklahoma Republicans. They have repeatedly found it preferable to plug budget gaps by raiding their state's emergency funds and forcing 1/5 of its school districts to adopt 4-day weeks. Now,
I didn't know I didn't know that was a thing until this happened.
Right. I mean, that's the thing that I was like, what the hell is a 4-day week?
I did not know that was a thing.
Just think about that for a second. In public schools, they're saying we can't afford to pay the teachers for a fifth, because again, they're doing that as to avoid paying all the staff for an additional day. That has to speak volumes to the citizens of Oklahoma, and they're not the only state that's done that. And of the four that we're talking about, they're not the only one. So again, we're looking at a direct correlation between cutting taxes for people that don't need the tax cuts, and again, looking at school systems that are now down to 4-day weeks. 4-day. I mean, and again, to your point, because you brought this up before, we're putting this up when you talk about the world stage. You're talking about Asian communities in Japan and China that they don't have summer break. And here we are with a 4-day school schedule for our children. What type of disservice does that do basically to the children that we're trying to raise up and put them in a marketplace to be competitive with other school districts that don't even take summer break?
Furthermore, if you can't afford a 5-day work week, a 5-day school week, that means that you don't have music, you don't have arts, you don't have gym, you don't have extracurricular activities. When you and I were at Proviso West, we were in choral groups, and we in the choir that we were in. We had we did the little tour thing where
student council,
but we did the little tour thing where we went out of town for 3 days. I mean, all of that stuff costs money. But if you can't even afford a 5-day school week, you're not getting any extracurricular activities.
None at all.
I'd love to see their football team.
And again, those things,
I'd love to see their football team's uniforms.
Right. Those things matter. When you say that, it immediately takes me back to The Simpsons. when they had the tether ball, but it was a brick.
It was a cinder block, wasn't it?
Right. It was a cinder block stuck to a string. I'm sorry. We're heavy Simpsons fans. Forgive us if you can't keep up with that. Our apologies.
William Turk just posted. William Turk just posted. You're assuming there is a cure for stupid. I am. I'm assuming that.
What we'd like to think is that because now that we've had the rise of the Tea Party, and we've had in several states, Kansas comes immediately to mind, certainly West Virginia, and Kentucky, because I think of their governor who refuses to do the Medicaid expansion. Bevin, I think, is his name. When I think of states immediately, we've had states now where we've done the big Republican grand experiment. All these things that they propose would happen, that if we would just cut those taxes and let the job creators do their thing, we would have these booming economies. It hasn't happened yet. Not only has it not happened, it's only gotten worse in all the states that it's been implemented. And at what point do the people that vote, to your point, say enough is enough?
But and to coattail on that point, because William also posted, the politicians' kids go to private school, and ultimately that's what we're talking about. When you say that when you hear Republicans get up there and all they talk about are tax cuts and the private sector and let the private sector do this, and there's a place for that. I'm certainly not against Milton Friedman and economics that believes in a thriving private market, and that there is something to be said for that. All you need to do is look, for a quick example, compare NASA to SpaceX. SpaceX has gotten to the point where they're able to do almost a launch every 2 weeks. NASA was never able to get to that point of efficiency because of the bureaucracy and so forth. So there is a place for the private sector, but the problem is that the politicians, who are all, for the most part, all of the politicians, all of the senators are millionaires. I know I read that recently, that all of the senators are millionaires and a big chunk of the House of Congress people. But if you're a millionaire, you hang around millionaires. So that's all you hear all day. When a lobbyist goes to talk to somebody, to talk to someone in Congress, that lobbyist is working for some K Street company, and that person is a millionaire. So again, when you get a bunch of rich people around one another, they're going to come up with ideas from their point of view. So again, taking it back to education, if you and everyone that you talk to, all of your kids go to private school because, the public school is so bad, or, in my area, I would never send my kid to the public school in the area. I would only send my kid to a private school.
We can keep that local too, because that's the dynamic that happens at Proviso West versus the Catholic schools out here. Correct.
And in some cases, that is a dynamic, that is a deciding factor. My daughter goes to a private school because the available public school that she would have to go to based on where she lives is the private school that she goes to is better. So, but the point is that if you're a politician and you send your kids to private school, and everyone who you know and everyone who you talk to on a regular basis sends their kids to public school, then you're gonna come to the conclusion that public schools, who cares about that? I don't know anybody who goes to public school except people who can't afford a good private school.
And that's on them. And that's like the Republican mantra, because whatever your life deficiency is, get your stuff together. That's they blame, it always goes back to, pull yourself up by the bootstraps kind of thing. And to quote Martin Luther King, to paraphrase him, it is insulting to tell someone to pull themselves up by the bootstraps when they don't have boots.
Exactly. Real quickly, as we end this, Terry Connor said it's easy for these teachers to vote for these policies because the same teachers who teach in these schools would never consider enrolling their kids in the same system.
Profound. Thank you so much for that comment, Terry.
Again, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about people. If you don't want to eat at the restaurant that you work at,
right.
That says a lot.
Right. I do want to bring up one point too, because because very quickly, because we're running out of time, but all of these states as well have teachers that are 48th, 49th in teacher pay, and I got a chance to look at some of the top teacher pay, and again, they broke it down by state, but it was all blue states. New York, California, their top teacher pay was, $70,000-$80,000 average. And now you get into, some of these other red states, and their average median teacher pay is, $32,000, $38,000. The reason that's important is not just from a fairness perspective, but because that means that those states cannot recruit the best talent. Because what teacher is going to go from a median state paying $60,000 to one where the median pay is $40,000? That means that those students not only are getting a 4-day work week, not only are they getting antiquated materials, old textbooks, overcrowded classrooms, they also aren't getting the best talent. That's something that, again, in America, the richest country in the world, that's a travesty, and it needs to be addressed immediately.
I think that's everything.
Yeah, that's it. So
we have to end it there.
We're gonna have to end it there. When we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we will be speaking to Mr. Jonathan Jackson on the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. Thank you for watching Humanity in the Headlines on IntellectualRadio.com. we are back on Humanity in the Headlines. Dave, I'm really excited about this next segment. I let me just say that I adore Martin Luther King Jr., as do most people. But I adore him not just for the stances that he took, not just for giving his life, but because he spoke plainly, and he never held his tongue, but he did it in such an eloquent, refined way. And I've always admired that about him. Obviously, he's one of the greatest orators this country has ever seen, if not the greatest. And as an African American boy, growing up, learning about him in school, that just always stuck with me. That he could compel people to just listen to every word that came out of his mouth, and he was just an amazing orator, an amazing man. And that we obviously we've never had anything like him since. We've come close, but nothing like MLK since. And I think 50 years after his death, we get a lot wrong about Martin Luther King. He's been sanitized, he's been whitewashed, and that's what I want to talk about today. What are some of the misconceptions that we have about Martin Luther King Jr., and then how does the perpetuation of those misconceptions hurt us and hold us back today? Joining us for this conversation, David, if you could introduce our wonderful guest.
Today, Jonathan Luther Jackson, born January 7th, 1966, is an American business professor, entrepreneur, and social justice advocate. He is the national spokesman of the Rainbow Push Coalition and a partner in a Chicago-based beer distributor, River North Sales and Service, LLC. Jackson was born Jonathan Luther Jackson in Chicago, Illinois, to Reverend Jesse Jackson, a noted civil rights activist and Baptist minister, and Jacqueline Lavinia Jackson. His godfather was the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., from whom Jackson gets his middle name. Joining us today, Mr. Jonathan Jackson. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing excellent. How are you? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. We're doing great. Thank you for joining us. We were opening up this segment talking about the misconceptions about Martin Luther King, but I think when we talk about misconceptions, it's really the largest misconception, I think, is that everyone always loved him, that he was always beloved, and that everything that he espoused was always embraced by the entire United. Can go ahead and speak to that, because am I wrong there that because everybody didn't love Martin Luther King when he was alive and he was doing the things that he was doing, right?
You are absolutely correct, and I appreciate your spirit in putting the foreground and the background in place, putting the frame and the context around Reverend Martin Luther King's life. Some people actually cheered at the sound of his death. Others were traumatized and mourned. Reverend Martin Luther King was called by the director of the FBI, whose name still stays on that building, talking about taking down Confederate statues. J. Edgar Hoover spied upon him, his home, his church, his work, his hotels, sent pictures to his house to try to embarrass him, threatened him, a man that was jailed over 29 times, a man that was indicted on income taxes. Reverend Martin Luther King is who we are speaking of, a man whom President Johnson called a nigger, whom African-American ministers in the city of Chicago, one very prominent minister was praying for Mayor Richard Daley for our daily bread, a man that when he died, Reverend Martin Luther King had approval ratings in the national polls of around 39%. That's in the neighborhood of Donald Trump. He was not a popular man at the age of 39, having influence and having been cordial with the president, consistently challenged him. And for the agenda that he challenged was never popular then or now. So I think many people come around to try to find a sanitized and a safe king. And he was not that. He was very controversial in the sense that he was not complacent. He was not compliant with injustice. Too many people are the exact opposite of that. And so they are respectable. They're not change agents. And so I appreciate your spirit in showing the pain and the tragedies. And if I could add one other thing, his life was not He did not give his life. He's not Jesus. He died from a 17-cent assassin's bullet. His life was taken. If you knew the time and date and place that you could be killed, would you go? He wasn't anticipating it, but he wasn't afraid of it either. So,
right.
Enormous. He had 4 children. He was 39. My father, Reverend Jesse Jackson, was 26. These young men were negotiating with the highest powers in the country at such a young age.
I appreciate you making that clarification, and that's really what I was trying to highlight, was not the fact, like you said, he didn't give his life, the fact that his life was taken, but that he had even forced that he kind of knew that he probably wouldn't make it. He knew that he likely would be taken out, but that never deterred him, not an inch, from doing the work that he needed to do.
In 1958, he was stabbed by a deranged woman, and his public ministry kept on 10 years after being stabbed in the chest. So from the time of Montgomery and saboteurs and house being bombed in the chest and all the death threats, that he just never gave up. Didn't have church security ministry, didn't have other persons. I mean, people were attacking him viciously. You remember he and Malcolm, to be described after the March on Washington as the Novocaine, to hide the pain, to have Jackie Robinson say that this isn't your place, Reverend Martin Luther King, to talk about the Vietnam War, because Jackie Robinson had been a soldier. He had been alienated. We have the National Baptist Convention and the National Progressive Convention to this very day, because the ministers in the National Baptist Convention did not want Reverend Martin Luther King to speak. A minister got pushed off the stage and a gun was drawn. That minister died, and it split the convention. So yes, he was a change agent, and we thank God for him.
And it's really interesting as you highlight that, because when you start talking about how the civil rights movement, we like to think, when we think back on Martin Luther King, we like to pretend like all of Black America was a monolith. And
Not at all.
And that all of Black America was 100% behind everything that he was trying to do. And again, that's how when we look back in retrospect. But I was even going to comment on how, when you brought up J. Edgar Hoover, I mean, at the time when Martin Luther King was alive, out of the FBI was putting forth this narrative that Martin Luther King was a communist. Now that sounds anodyne when you say it today, but when you put it in its historical context, that we were still fighting the Soviet Union at the time, and to call someone a communist, that was a heavy thing to call someone at the time.
Well, and he further said, Mr. J. Edgar Hoover, who was given the authorization to tap his phones from then Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, that J. Edgar Hoover said that Reverend Martin Luther King is the most dangerous man in America.
Exactly.
Right. And that's the framing that we tend to forget. That's what gets lost 50 years later. That's what gets lost now that his birthday is a national holiday. And that's exactly why we wanted to have this show. So my question to you, Mr. Jackson, is, and again, I just really thank you for being on today, is this: how does that hurt us today by sanitizing what he stood for, especially as it pertains to labor rights and equality?
Let me take a stab at that. I think words do matter. That we have Christmas for the birth of Jesus, and that's a celebration. We have Easter for the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, which is what gives us our strength and our power. I think we should separate very clearly the birth date of Reverend Martin Luther King, January 15th, that he had no control over. That's the celebration of God's gift. And I think we need to commemorate April 4th, his death date, when an assassin killed him. I think as a culture, as a society, to set aside some time that is holy, to reflect back upon an apostle of peace that fought for God's will. Now, how does it hurt us? It hurts us in so many ways. First of all, if you get a chance to go to the monument in Washington, D.C. for Reverend Martin Luther King, when the quotes were put up on that monument. Not one quote had any reference to God. Here's a minister who didn't have a security force. He doesn't have one of his quotes with a reference to God. That's one thing. I think that it's interesting that people call him Dr. Martin Luther King as opposed to Reverend Martin Luther King. You know, if in grammar and salutation matters. His higher calling is to be a reverend, not a doctor. Anybody can write a PhD and a thesis. His calling, his vocal from the Greek, is what he was willing to give his life for, to want to be a drum major for justice. And so I think we have to separate the two, and that can give us further strength. And as it relates to today and labor rights, couldn't help but be in Memphis, Tennessee, and think of the tri-state area, Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee, and think of Mr. Al Gore having been a senior senator and his father, Bill Clinton, and Al Gore being president and vice president, and Hillary Clinton having been in Little Rock, and for the past presidents, Democrats, not to all be down in Memphis 50 years later. What does that really say? That's a high moment for American life, American culture. And what's the unintended consequence? Millions more of children will not know about it because these persons did not come, that they are the beneficiaries of his work. So yes, it hurts us today because who should have been there? I tell you this, I was on a plane leaving Memphis, and I had to connect through Dallas and on to Chicago, and I was in the row 30 in the center seat on Southwest, and I was the smallest person in the row, and I'm 260. So I'm leaning forward, so I got a chance to know these other men beside me very well. And one guy said, "Yeah, I don't hear much from Jesse these days." And I said, "So that's my father." He said, "Oh, really?" I said, "Yeah, he's coming of age now. He's 76, but he's never stopped in 50 years." I said, "You know, where are the senators? Where are the past presidents that have Secret Service, that have government positions? Where's our best and brightest? You know, they can come here now and lend a hand and not throw a stone. They weren't there then when Martin Luther King was alive, and now that they've benefited, some people you don't see anymore, you know?"
Go ahead. No, and that's a great point. I was just going to follow up because I think we touched on two of the three things that Martin Luther King's life and his ministry was about. It was certainly about civil rights first. It was certainly about he was anti-war because he was very vocal and he spoke out against the Vietnam War, which again, when you think about the climate that we're in now, even today, it can be dangerous. It can certainly be hard to speak out against the war machine. But the third thing and the biggest thing that really gets whitewashed, especially by the right, is that he spoke out about socioeconomic injustice as it pertained to the poverty or the disproportionately higher percentage of poverty in the African American community when you compare that to the majority. But am I getting that wrong? Because again, when a lot of times
no, you are spot on, and let me pick that up right where you are. Is that when he went down to Memphis to work with, now they're called sanitation workers.
Exactly.
All of my life they've been called garbage workers.
Right.
Okay. And so to try to sanitize that these were just some other people that were doing a hard day's work. No, they didn't have the respect of people then, and they don't have the respect of people now. Ask the mega church minister to make room for the garbage workers on the front row. You know, it's just never been a popular group of people to even be affiliated with. But his humility drove him. And when he said that, it's not what will happen to Martin Luther King, it's what will happen to these men if I'm not here standing with them. Well, 50 years later, after Reverend Martin Luther King's death, Memphis in some ways has blossomed. Transportation distribution has grown. It's the worldwide headquarters for Federal Express, that at one point was the nation's largest airline because Federal Express had 700 planes. That was bigger than United American, because we're getting packages all over the country at night. It's the headquarters of AutoZone and the Memphis Grizzlies, and you've got the St. Jude Hospital Center that was very prominent with Danny Kaye. They raise over $1 billion a year. A fabulous institution, by the way. The point I'm making is all these major institutions are there, yet Memphis has a population of roughly 650,000 people. The city population is 63% African American. They have a white mayor. They have a white congressman. Over a city that's 63% African American. It is the largest, poorest city in America. Memphis, Tennessee, with the Elvis Presley Museum and all the economics. They have a casino, Beale Street. New money is in town. They are a part of the tourism fabric, and yet the forces of discrimination and racism has locked out African Americans from having evolved economically in the last 50 years in Memphis. So Reverend Martin Luther King would have something to say about that today. I think you're spot on. His economic mission is where he planted my father in Chicago to start Operation Bread Baskets, fighting for a piece of the bread that long after our politics of respectability and dignity, that he saw that our liberal allies were not our partners in equality, asking for a fair chance. Sure, our children, we tell them they have to be twice as good and have to do everything better. But if they can score 11 free throws and the other team scores 10 and we can win by 1 point, we still should be able to accept it. Not we should have blown them out. No, like we're only human as well. And so I think we have to continue to level the playing field, which has been my father's work in Reverend Martin Luther King's name for over these last 50 years. And I find it amazing that people say, well, what's happened in 50 years? Well, a lot has happened for the good. Unfortunately, I just think we're entering into such a selfish generation.
That's a great point you bring up. I'd like to, as time comes to a close, I'd like for you to hit on two things before we let you go. I'd like you to talk about what would Martin Luther King have to say about right to work states and the current form of voter suppression.
Well, he would tell you, I believe, I hate to quote him, is that he thought in his lifetime he saw Jim Crow die, but unfortunately, as we know the story of Frankenstein is the doctor, it's not the monster. And that the Dr. Frankenstein have created some more Jim Crows now with 32 teeth, eating bagels, having yogurt, jogging, writing algorithms that discriminate in certain African-American neighborhoods, that makes our insurance higher for automobiles and for home, that makes our mortgage higher on our houses, that reduces our credit scores. I mean, that Jim Crow is alive and well. I think what he would tell us today is that we've had 250 years of slavery, 100 years of legalized slavery / Jim Crow, and that we've only been 50 years really with the right to vote. And exactly. So it's up to us to pick it up and stop acting like it's ever been easy. No, it's never been easy. And it's never going to get easy. And so I don't want people to feel discouraged. But I do think that we have to bring our children to civil rights events, meetings that see our children doing better than ever, graduating from school, getting great degrees. They're going to matriculate in the next couple of weeks from high school and college, and they're going to see this odorless, colorless, cyanide wall of discrimination that's going to lock them out of industry. And that is what we have to do as adults, to raise our children to look forward to their challenges that they're going to have to fight. I don't understand how we've let so many children come by without recognizing racism, afraid to call it out, embarrassed, thinking they've done something wrong. This is fueling suicide in our community that we've never seen before. Our children are blaming themselves. They don't know what's wrong. And I think that's our job, and I appreciate you all doing the work that you do.
Mr. Jonathan Jackson, we really appreciate you joining us today. Before we let you go, tell all of our watcher, all the people watching, and all of our listeners how they can get in touch with you or Rainbow Push, or let them know how they can get involved with your network.
Well, they can reach me through you. That's the easiest way. You can go to rainbowpush.org. Rainbowpush.org. Go to our info site. Please fill it in. We meet every Saturday at 930 East 50th Street in Chicago, 930 East 50th Street, Chicago, Illinois. At 10 a.m., we have a live worldwide television program. There's no admission, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Yeah, I've been there a couple of times. I've always enjoyed it. As a matter of fact, I was there last when Michael Eric Dyson was in town to promote his book.
Well, all right. Come back again.
You got it.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson.
God bless you.
You too.
Thanks for your work. Bye-bye.
Great conversation. Again, it's really important when we think about Martin Luther King that we remember that when he was alive, he was not beloved by everyone.
Much like Muhammad Ali and other people that we later again sanitize and make them great, but at the time those views of truth telling were not very popular.
And I you know what, that's really at the end of the day, that's really the lesson that we need to learn, is that if you tell the truth, most people would rather hear a really good lie than to hear the hard truth. And that's just the case.
Right. So we thank you so much, everyone, for listening today, for all of your comments. And again, feel free to share the show on Facebook Live. Join us next week. We will be back. Same bat time, same bat channel. Everyone have a blessed and safe weekend. We thank Breon Jones, our producer, for this wonderful show. And of course, we thank Mr. Earl Winfrey for this platform. Everyone take care. And we'll be back next week on Humanity in the Headlines. Thanks so much.